Welcome to Fortuna Admissions Masterclass. This is the first in a series of three to set you on the road to business school. In the next hour, we will be focusing on how to nail the essays of your MBA application. At a recent 10 school event with the admissions directors of Harvard, Stanford, Wharton, Columbia, Sloan, Chicago Booth Kellogg, Berkeley Haas. You can see where I'm going. Many of the top schools. One of the attendees at the event in London asked the distinguished panel if they were seeing many application essays written by large language models, the ChatGPTs of the world. The response was a resounding yes, that it was easy to detect and very easy to then reject that candidate. They commented that the essays were grammatically correct, no doubt, but they had no personal flavor, and it could have described any of the consultants, bankers, software engineers that were applying to business school. Now, I hope that you will have lots of questions for my distinguished panel of rock stars of the admissions world from Fortuna as we delve into essays to give you that sense of authenticity, finding your voice in the panels. I'm joined by Sharon Joyce. Sharon is one of our most experienced Fortuna coaches. She was a former Berkeley Haas Associate Director of Admissions, also an Associate Dean at Berkeley at the school. Melissa Jolson, who another of our great Fortuna coaches, and Melissa, a natural storyteller, which explains the role as Director of Communications that she had at INSEAD. And Maren Savage, another superstar coach and a former admissions reader for the Stanford GSB, an extension of the Stanford MBA that she enjoyed. She also worked in admissions at Berkeley Haas and Carnegie Mellon. So you can imagine with that roster, I'm just along for the ride, both to prompt them and move from one slide to the other, but also keep a track on your questions as we go through this session. We really want this to be about you, to answer your questions and provide lots of insight, because for the next 60 minutes, look at the packed agenda as we look at the place that the essays play in the overall application process. This is going well beyond GMAT scores and GPA. Of course, what the schools are looking for, things to avoid always, and just where to get started as you take that step back and really think deeply about your background, where business school fits. So we've got so much to cover. And I think we're just going to put that in the context and start with Maren. In terms of the essays themselves, they've been asking these for decades, Maren. So why do the MBA essays matter so much to the admissions committee?
Yeah, it's a great question and a great place to start, Matt. So thanks for this. Happy to be here. Happy to be talking about essays, a very, very important piece of the application. My background coming from admissions, I'd like to think firstly about through the lens of an admissions reader for a moment, right? So let's lock in that shoes for a second. Think about an admissions team. They would already have been taken in your transcripts. They've come through those, the test scores, resumes, letters of recommendation. They've read through them, combed through the evidence that's found within those pieces of the application. Hopefully, if you've done your work really well between those pieces and through the application itself, that is already chock full of evidence. It's already showcasing your strengths, right? Your decision-making process, how you chose certain roles and what you did, how you contributed within those. It'll also have pieces about your trajectory, right? How you moved up in roles, how you moved laterally from one company to another, so on and so forth, right? So I'm getting these great nuggets throughout the application as I'm building up to reading your essay. And then I get to that essay, right? And that essay is that place where I take a deep breath and I could say, wow, this person is really coming to life, right? So it connects that evidence to your story and what's really personally meaningful to you. When those things come together to make a compelling application, then I can really see who you are and I can see what your goals and ambitions are. And they're attached to this evidence that you've presented, but they also give me the why behind that what you did. So that's why the essay matters. It really pulls it all together and demonstrates to me what it is that's propelling you towards your goals.
Maren, perhaps just an obvious personal question. Your role at the GSB was about admitting great candidates. It wasn't about rejecting great candidates. So in terms of, looking through hundreds and hundreds of essays every year, did you enjoy the essays as a way to get to know the candidate?
I really, really did. And I'll tell you what, it's sort of, and it's not just in, you're gathering all this evidence along the way. You're really getting a good idea for this person is a really compelling applicant. But you could see, across various different industries, sometimes that's harder to discern than others. There's real objective measures in some industries, others there isn't, right? But if you could pull together this great evidence over the application, I already feel this great groundswell about this person. I have an inclination as to what it is that's really tremendous about them. And then when I get to the essay and it's an essay that's deeply personal and really, really reflective and shows me that level of self-reflection and thoughtfulness, it sinks and I get you and I get why it is that you've done the things that you do. It's a really wonderful moment when you see a compelling application that is able to very well bring those pieces together.
Mhm. Sharon, as you were working with Pete Johnson, with Jet and the rest of the team at Haas, would you ever read an essay and just like, I have to meet this person? Because we framed it as, one step towards the interview process. Did you ever have that immediate reaction?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, certainly on admit days, there would be people who we would make a point of, I need to meet, waterfall boy, like someone who took all these beautiful photos of a waterfall and shared that in their essay, or someone who had, overcome a big obstacle and having a chat with them about that as well. And um, I think sometimes these prospective students, these people who'd been admitted, were a little bit taken aback of like, oh my gosh, you really do read everything. It's not just a numbers game. It really is reading people, making sure there's a fit there, and thinking about how this person's going to give back to the Haas community. And so, yes, part of the job that was really delightful was, putting a face to a story and getting to know those students, a little bit more too as they progress through the program.
Right. Melissa, before we got started, we were quoting Mark Twain. You can quote Mark Twain on almost anything. A great storyteller. Fundamentally, is it because it really captures that personal sense of self through the stories? We'll be talking about data points for test scores and other things, but it really is through stories that you can capture the individual.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, I think that's why it's so much fun to do what we do. Because when you're working with candidates who really reveal themselves and work to develop an authentic, compelling story, then it changes everything, right? Um, and the
We've
opposite
all
is
had
true.
that sort of aha moment with candidates, perhaps holding up that mirror,
Yeah.
and often them learning things about themselves, right? It's a precious moment.
Oh,
Well,
that's what they often say is that it's really a journey for them. They've learned not just how to get into business school, but they've learned so much about themselves.
right. Well, as we continue our own journey through this webinar, Maren, the idea perhaps some candidates thinking, what does Stanford want to hear? Or what am I supposed to say to Wharton? Um, we framed it as what schools are really looking for. How would you break that down?
Yeah, so just kind of echoing what we've all been saying, there's evidence throughout the application, but plus this storyline that's really, really self-reflective that showcases your unique point of view, what's really personally meaningful to you, and then creating that logical career path that clearly follows those two things, right? What's going to really compel you towards those goals, and then do you have evidence that shows me that you can do that, that you can apply yourself in that manner. So those ingredients together, I think, combine for a compelling why you argument. And then the other side of this, because it's a relationship that goes both ways, right, is the love story about that particular school, right? So you showed me that you understand what an MBA is. That's oftentimes kind of a difficult thing for candidates to do. Is do you understand what an MBA is? What it's good for? The great thing is you have coaches over here in Fortuna who have MBAs or have worked with MBAs, right? So you can explore that further to a level of depth. And then how this particular program is specifically fits. That's kind of gaps analysis that you did, reflecting where you are and where you seek to be. So I could see this extended journey out in front of you. So then I'm really getting an understanding for what's very true of you, both in a professional sense, certainly, but also what's personally very resonant and differentiating about you. And then what's true of this school to make you guys this perfect match, this perfect love story?
Hey, we brought romance into the webinar. That can't be bad because there was I thinking that it was, Sharon, that it was fairly transactional. Nevertheless, I mean, if I go back, I've been working in the industry so long. I remember Harvard having 8 essays or schools that had no word lengths. But we've emphasized the ability, to bring that love story down into very clear and concise skills. Why is that?
Oh, is that to me?
Yes.
Ah, I think just to be sure that again, in this holistic review, just being sure that we are touching on all of the pieces and the components. And again, just getting beyond stats and things like that, making sure that schools are bringing in people who are not only going to be kind of happy students, but kind of this life cycle then of happy alumni, and then maybe even someday happy donors. But I think that schools are looking to build relationships that are going to last, again, not just those 2 years, but well beyond that. Just as students plan on doing with each other, I think sometimes it's interesting that students, and we'll talk about this a little bit later when I'm chatting about some of the different pieces of, but like, how are you also showing that you're going to be building community that will last kind of this lifetime throughout your career professionally and also personally?
Mm. Well, as a Stanford MBA, Marin, of course, I mean, you had 2 extraordinarily fulfilling, happy years at the GSB, and how you could reflect that. When we talk about showing an understanding of school fit and culture, the temptation might be, you know what, I'm just going to pack in lots of examples of electives that I want to do. But I could do that, right? And just fill them in paragraph 8 and 9. When you talk about that genuine understanding, what is it that would really then resonate with the admissions office?
Yeah, I think that what would resonate with the admissions office is what would deeply resonate with you. So that's the real work that's to be done, right? Do the research on the school for your own benefit. Just like any relationship that you're entering into, and this one happens to be a good amount of time, a good amount of money, a good level of investment, where you are going to be challenged and pushed and pulled. You're developing a new set of best friends who are going to challenge you to be better versions of yourself. We're bringing in very diverse sets of backgrounds and strengths. And you're going to have moments where you're doubting yourself and your own abilities. You'll have imposter syndrome and so on and so forth. So do the work to better understand, um, does the curriculum suit what it is that I need? And think about that for a moment. What is it that I need, right? Do I have I done the self-reflection and that gaps analysis to be able to understand what it is that I will have to bring to the table and what it is that I need to work on and to fill out? So looking through that curriculum, the professors that are there, the research that's being done, what's available to you in terms of the flexibility of the curriculum. Is it very hands-on and experiential? Is it international? Is it global? Does it have the right sets of conversations that are going to be happening around the classroom? And then what sort of people are drawn to that particular school? And then what are the outcomes? So talking to students, current students, talking to alums. If you don't have them readily available, I use LinkedIn like crazy. Just ping people. People are very, very generous with their time. If you are courteous, obviously, and have you're giving them a clear indication about what you're looking for in the conversation. I think they're generally happy to do it. So really get down to that level of make it your own personal journey, not what is it that AdCom wants to hear from me? What is the common student looking for in a program, but more so, what is it you specifically need on your journey?
Right. Now, Melissa will be starting us off on those early steps and the introspection that's involved. But just before we go there, one final point, Sharon, if we can discuss with you on the slide, the sense of who you are beyond the resume. Is that also a reminder? There are lots of pieces of the puzzle in admissions. And of course, this is one of 3 masterclasses we're holding over the coming weeks as we look at recommendations and other aspects of the application. With the essays, do you need to be very mindful about what the school already knows about you?
I think that maybe this is going to be a little bit silly because we're kind of stuck on this love story piece, but I would say that I think that you need to think about your essays as kind of a big flirt, because I definitely have worked with clients who they get so fixated on, I need to tell the school everything under the sun about myself, when really it's like, what is the prompt asking you? And what are some sound bites about you that are going to appeal to the person who is reading you on the other side of the screen? So I think it's, yes, getting beyond the resume. And what are some things that you can say about your background that really will appeal to that program, especially if you've had opportunities to visit, or as Maren suggested, speaking with alumni and current students, are you a fit for that program culturally? Obviously you want to leverage the curriculum, the co-curriculars, things like that. But at the end of the day, are you the right fit for that school? And how can you really play that up in sort of a flirty, fun way so that the school does want to interview you? I mean, keep in mind the application is what gets you invited to interview. It's not what gets you admitted per se. So I think that sometimes clients want to make that step, or prospective students want to take that step of like, this application in total is what's getting me admitted, when really what it's doing is it's kind of the gatekeeper of who's invited to interview and who is not. So I think that using your essays to really, this is your first voice that they're going to hear through your written word. And so I think it's just making sure that you're presenting yourself in a way that's very authentic and true. And that also really meshes with what that school is looking for in terms of their community members.
Now, this webinar will be available on Fortuna's YouTube channel. I think that the viewing numbers are going to spike around February the 14th each year. But yeah, here's the first date, and we're hoping that we can then reveal enough without perhaps revealing too much to get the second date. And it is, Melissa, we talked about a journey and this idea of self-reflection. We've been studying really hard, and then the early stages of our career, long hours, putting in all of that effort. And now here's this gift from business schools that says, step back, and we'd love you to think about these themes. Where do you like to start as we think about the introspection that's involved in this journey?
Oh, it's actually, that is the first step for me when you're working on the essays, is the introspection. Um, there's a kind of a desire I've noticed among candidates to sort of like jump in and start writing, because they're feeling a little bit like, they're busy, and they know this is probably the harder part of the application, and so they want to just jump in and start writing, and that's what not to do. I mean, what you really need to do is take a step back. I mean, Sharon, you mentioned being authentic and compelling essays. You can't get an authentic and a compelling essay if you haven't taken the time to step back and really think about, what are your experiences until then? It's a moment, it's a journey. As we said earlier, it's more than just these essays. You will come away, if you do the work as it should be done with the introspection, you will come away with a greater sense of who you are. So that's an added benefit. But it's really so important for your essays. So, it's, don't jump in right away. Take a step back, introspect, reflect on your experiences before you start to write, and think about, what drives you, what makes you feel most alive. You maybe had an aha moment, in these last years, where you realized, hey, this is something that I really love doing, and that comes to me naturally, that I'm quite good at. I'm in the flow. Those are the things you want to think about. Well, when did you have that realization? What were you doing? What are your values, and how do they shape your decisions? You can think about that in a professional context, or, even earlier on in your academics. And you'll also, of course, want to think about your leadership style and defining moments. Now, how do you do all of that, right? Well, there are different ways. You can use tools like the Clifton Strengths, which is, a very well-known assessment test that really helps you understand what you're naturally good at and how you can use it. And we have coaches like Sharon, I know, who is an accredited Clifton Strengths coach. And that's a great tool to use. There are other tools as well. And obviously, you can brainstorm with a coach. At Fortuna, You know, Matt, you know this because I know whenever the candidates come, you always push, you know, and say, take the time to reflect and introspect. We have a strategy document. And it's a strategy document that we believe helps candidates, you know, take the time and to introspect, and then helps the coaches better understand and help them to, you know, to help them to write their essays. And it has sort of a lot of questions that are sort of questions you might just sort of say, yeah, okay, you know, what are your challenges? What are your greatest achievements in your roles, in their professional roles? But then there are other ones that are also a little bit more personal, about your values, but also, for example, was there another career path you considered? And, you know, what was it and why? And all of that comes together to, you know, help us help you to introspect. And I think that, you know, whether you work alone, whether you work with a coach, however you go about it, you know, take the time to introspect.
Right. When we look, Maren, there's an implicit vibrancy, I think, when we talk about, you know, what makes you feel most alive. Now, perhaps that's K-pop or, you know, wonderful Italian food. What drives you? If the candidate's sitting there saying, well, money, power, you know, the art of the deal. We have the leader of the free world who's obviously focused on that one. Maren, are there any sort of parameters, you know, to be able to dig deeper and think about those underlying characteristics that really drive a person?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think Melissa hit I actually really focused in on when Melissa's talking about values and how they shape your decisions. And that's why we go so far back in that strategy question that she was speaking about. Um, Back to like values and like conversations around the dinner table growing up, or maybe if you had challenges, what did you learn from them? What did you draw from them? Because you've got to do the work to map out what it is that has been that kind of common thread. And I think that there's two kind of practical things that we haven't talked about yet that I'd point to. One is consider the fact that, like, as you're saying, Matt, like you think about the sorts of people who are maybe in a finance bucket or maybe in a consulting bucket, right? And sometimes clients will say, oh, well, I do performance reviews. So I already I have this whole like, I already have all of these great things that are already pulled out. I don't have to do all of that work. But think about when you're applying to one of these top schools, most people are, not just in your firm, right? But all of the firms that are similar to yours, and they're all top bucket. They're all top 5%. We're all fast tracked. We're all given these additional opportunities and so on. So I will submit that from the reader's point of view, that's absolutely not enough. You are one of several who are very, very smart, very, very dedicated, have these great extracurriculars where they've been a leader, where they have contributed, and so on and so forth. So oftentimes, I'll see applications that kind of reflect just that, which I would say, which is surprising to hear, I think, by clients, is that that's fairly superficial level of information for me. And I can't discern from that how you are necessarily superior, how I can't see, right, how you would be beneficial to this school just because you're top bucket, just because you're awfully smart, just because you make a lot of money. That's simply not enough. Unless you kind of go below that and say, okay, here's what I faced in my life. Here's how I've reflected. Here's how I learned. Then I can start to see you in a vibrant classroom where I don't need perfect. I need somebody who has shown me that they can learn, they can grow, they can adapt, they can be resourceful, they can bring others together and say, hey, I actually disagree with that. And I invite you to see my point of view, but we'll be open to other people's viewpoints, right? I don't need perfect stats. I need somebody who I can see would be a very good fit for the program, as we were talking about earlier, and a contributor to the program, a contributor to the dialogue, but specifically how. And that comes from that deep reflection, introspection, and that log line. And I say log line because the other practical thing that I think you have to think about, which is true of admissions, is that you're in a whole, you're in a big pool of different candidates who are very similar in terms of your background. That's why you guys are at this top firm, right? At the end of the day, AdCom needs a very good couple of lines about you. Like think about that sound bite that's resoundingly true of you. If you're throwing everything at me, then I'm like, okay, well, they're this person, but they are also sort of this person in these circumstances and this person in this sort of circumstances. I don't really get a complete version of you that I can kind of distill down to a couple lines to talk about. As Sharon said earlier, are you this person? Are you that person? Are you the person that did XYZ, right? What's really your hook and your soundbite? And does that come across very clearly in an application?
With a daughter whose middle name is Rainbow, I'm clearly very interested to meet Waterfall Boy. He sounds like he's got a great story. But Sharon, if I can bring together two of those points, another string to your accomplished bow is Clifton Strengths, and as a certified coach. But as we look at values that have shaped decisions, perhaps where you went to school, a career switch that you made, you left New York to go and take care of your mom who needed your help. Um, Candidates can sometimes struggle to be able to tie those two together and values that emerge. How do you help them to see the underlying values that that particular decision might express?
So interesting. We're having this conversation. I had this conversation with a client yesterday, in writing, tackling the Stanford, what matters most and why. I mean, that's a big question, right? And so some of the things that she's writing at and getting to what Maren just said, she writes well, but it's not tapping into what does motivate her. And so really we are looking at some things deeply from childhood. I mean, sometimes I feel like we should all be sent therapy couches to send to our clients' homes so they can lay back and kind of talk a little bit. But it's okay actually if you're motivated by money, particularly if you were someone who didn't come from money. And so knowing that that opens up freedom to you and things like that. And so we're really digging deep in terms of getting at those values because a lot of them were shaped so early on. And one thing about Clifton's strengths that I think is interesting in using other assessment tools, though, too, is like sometimes we walk through life knowing that we sort of intrinsically do things, but we've never labeled it, or we've never really thought about how we utilize, different talents. And so I think also partnering things like Clifton Strengths, or, even with clients who have ever taken a Myers-Briggs or something like that, like bringing that into the practice as well in terms of talking about some things that are just kind of so deep within you, and then unpacking that a little bit to get at some of those really introspective questions like what matters most to you and why, what makes you feel alive when doing it and why. And so it's a lot of exploration. So we have the strategy document, we have the leadership skills assessment. I mean, to toot Fortuna's horn, we have sort of a whole curriculum to get at these things before we start in earnest with the writing.
Yeah, well, maybe that Fortuna couch beyond coaching it will become a reality. Melissa, sometimes the schools until recently, Harvard was saying, okay, we've looked at the resume, we read the recommendations, our essay for you. What more should we know about you? Which felt very open-ended, almost ambiguous. Where do I start? Maren
Yes.
referenced earlier, going back to childhood. So again, as you think about this and a story that you're trying to share, how do you like to break that down with clients to give that sense of structure and what they're trying to convey?
Well, it is about, sort of going beyond. I mean, what everyone is sort of saying is going beyond just the professional, what you've done, right? It's getting to see somebody from a lot of different perspectives. And I mean, I had a candidate recently say she apologized for, using me as her sort of like um, therapist, if you will. But, it is part of what we do because you do really drill down into somebody's life to understand and to help them tell their story. Um, Now the open-ended questions, these are not the traditional sort of, you know, what are your career objectives and, what about your leadership? These are the questions that are a bit more personal. And you mentioned it earlier, but the Stanford, the iconic open-ended question is currently is Stanford's what matters most to you and why? I mean, there you really have to get very personal and it's not an easy thing to do. So you need to have sort of a screenwriter's approach, right? This is time to put your Francis Ford Coppola hat on and think about, the storytelling about it. Um, and you don't want to edit early on, meaning you want to start listing ideas, different vignettes, things that have happened to you in your life. Maybe it starts off very small. You don't sort of say, oh, man, that's not good. No, just put them all down, right? Um, and and then you want to sit back and think, okay, what are the most high impact vignettes that we have? What are the most compelling stories that really help tell the story of who I am? Um, I had a candidate recently who, often candidates don't think that they have really kind of interesting stories to tell. And so sometimes there's a problem where they want to tell a story they think should be told, which isn't really the story often that is the one that should be told, because that's the one that doesn't feel like it's really getting to who the person is. And it's actually through our work with candidates that sometimes and I'm sure all of Sharon and Maren, you both feel this way. You discover a story that didn't come up for a while because the candidate didn't really think it was interesting. And I had a candidate who, it finally, after we'd worked together for a while, I finally learned that, when he was about 10, his cousin, who was also his own age, was diagnosed with very, serious diabetes. And in the country where he lived, they didn't have very advanced care to help him. And he had to travel a lot, and it was a very difficult time for the whole family. And he said that's when he decided that he wanted to work in healthcare. He wanted to change what was available in his country, but also he just wanted to help improve healthcare. But that came up after a while. That takes time to really think about these kinds of things, like, why did you choose your career? Now, maybe it is because, I'm really good with numbers and I wanted to go into finance, but not everybody who's applying to business school is in that case. And while I know the candidate I just mentioned, his story may seem to other candidates like, oh, well, that's a really unique story. My experience working with candidates is as I have never met a candidate who didn't have really interesting stories to tell. They may not think that they're that interesting, and it may take time to really drill down. And that's where, a lot of the self-reflection comes in. But that said, you also need to think about so what. So, if you're telling a story, and then you're looking at it with the angle of, okay, now I've had other essays as well. How does this fit in? Does this show another side of me or not? So what? And that leads me to then, create a sense of inevitability about your MBA. And there I'd say, yes, you want to show that, all paths lead to this MBA journey that you want to take on. But again, it may be a combination of the open-ended question, other questions as well, other essays, because it's a whole picture that you're weaving, that comes together through different essays. And some schools have, a lot of open-ended questions, like LBS, for example. And that all comes together to show a picture of a person that goes beyond, the resume and the job and all the rest, and hopefully will get you an interview.
Right. Sharon, with this idea of sort of laying everything out and the launch questionnaire that really helps to explore across academics, professional, community engagement, passions and interests, and sometimes seeing patterns, something that was in the last year of high school that's then come back a few years later. As you're having those discussions with clients, do you think that ability to connect those dots, see those patterns, then gives this added substance? Because one thing to share in the essays, but you might also be talking about this in an interview, and you've helped them to have real ownership about choices that they've made, the impact of things that they've done.
Sure, for sure. And I'm thinking in particular about a client I worked with who was an engineer. And I think that sometimes, we stereotype, right? Like engineers, very quantitatively focused, maybe, a little nerdy, a little wooden. This client I was working with, though, in terms of just going through the different documents and conversations, I don't think he ever realized what a relationship builder he was, from very early on, like someone who was very good at connecting others, wanting to also be a developer in terms of bringing out strengths in others to do well, whether that was on a sports team that he was leading in high school, to in his workplace, kind of culminating with this really precious story of something that he did to bring his team together at a really remote work site in Kazakhstan. And when I was starting to draw that out of him, he was like, why does that even matter? I'm like, because it's so unique. It's such a neat story for you to bring in. Because again, fair or unfair, when I would sit down and read 30 applications a day, 3 days a week for many, many, many months, sometimes if I would open up a file and be like, oh boy, here we go, another engineer. And then all of a sudden, though, I'm delighted with this story that I didn't expect. I think that that's kind of finding that wow factor, finding that spark that's going to help you connect with that other person on the side of the screen who's reading you with something that's very relatable too, in terms of bringing, different pieces of team culture or something you do as a connector or something that you do as someone who is passionate about the environment. So I think it's just finding these like points of spark within yourself through that introspective piece.
Right. Maren, I know that how enthusiastic and supportive you are with clients, but there's a tough side to you too, and maybe it's embedded in this bullet point about so what, the hidden question. And presumably that's a point of resistance. They could tell this story and when it happened and where it happened. Why are you pushing them towards so what? What are you trying to reveal?
Yeah, that's always the question after every vignette. It's okay, but so what? And maybe it's from years and years and reading applicants from the finance pool, the biggest pool, the most crowded pool. I think it's hard. It's hard to pull yourself. It's hard to, for one, be objective about yourself and see yourself from like, a bird's eye view, see the forest through the trees, right? I a lot of times, and I think this is true of engineering or whatever discipline you're really from, it's that point of view that you've always seen the world. And so that world becomes kind of that's full stop what your world is. And so what for you is I'm really good at optimizing a cap table. Okay, well, that's great. But from an outside perspective, a reader whose world isn't just finance, what's the so what for me? What's the so what for your peers in the classroom? Why is that important that you are the best at, financial engineering, right? So we want to get beyond that. I can understand that from your resume. I could see that from your letters of recommendation. But what's really important about that? What's the bigger aha of, oh, okay, now I can see how that would be beneficial across various different case studies, right? Various different businesses and atmospheres. So that's really the so what. So I take you out of this particular environment where you really thrived. Will you thrive elsewhere? Is that transferable? So what are those kind of, I'd say, more fundamental skills, right? And those tend to be a bit more personal, interpersonal, around leadership, around engaging with others, around bringing a bigger picture together around what it is that you've done.
Well, you've just introduced for us the theme of leadership, which is where we're headed next. And of course, as you think about a resume, whether it's an associate level position or a software engineer level two, job titles perhaps rarely capture, Melissa, the sort of underlying leadership characteristics. So, what is it again that schools would love to discover about you and those qualities of leadership that can emerge in so many different facets of our life?
Yes, I mean, leadership is not just about having a, so to speak, leadership role or, a title that reflects that you are a leader. Leadership can be leading a team. Leadership can be taking initiative in a project and leading a project. It can come in a lot of different ways, if you will. And schools do want to know. They want to know what kind of a leader you are and what kind of leader you want to be, right? And so a lot of schools have questions around leadership, and you've open-ended questions, you have leadership questions, And so, for example, Harvard used to have, it was sort of the iconic open-ended question with along with Stanford's, basically tell us whatever you want to tell us. And you've got 900 words. And now, they've changed that. Actually, not that long ago, it was last year, I think. Now they have three shorter questions. One is a leadership question, which is what experiences have shaped how you invest in others and how you lead? So how do you approach that kind of a question? They want to see how you lead, and like I said, whether or not you have that in your title. Focus on a specific experience, moment of action, decision, or tension. Highlight how you elevated others, team dynamics, inclusion, collaboration. Again, whether or not you've led a team. Reflect on values and action. What guided you? What did you learn? And importantly, don't be afraid to show vulnerability or struggle. How did you grow? I mean, all of the applicants applying to business school are going to be trying to show that they are great leaders. I don't think that's going to surprise anyone. So, in fact, telling your story for the leadership is so important. And the truism with all of your essays, which is it's better to show rather than to tell, is probably most important here. So the authenticity will shine through, particularly if you do show vulnerability, show what you learned from it and how you've addressed it. And you give examples. You really need to, the storytelling is so important for the leadership. It's not enough to say, I'm this kind of leader. Well, I want to hear how you came to that conclusion. What was the situation you were in? Were you managing a team and something happened and this is where you discovered this is the type of leader you are? And then it goes back, to earlier, we're talking about, how do you discover what kind of leader you are? Doing the introspection to begin with, to start, working with a coach, Clifton Strengths. There are all different ways to do that.
Perhaps extending our Netflix series and the first date, Sharon. This idea of on a first date showing vulnerability, or when things didn't work out, because perhaps many candidates, I need to shine, I need to show that in each situation I had the right answer. There were these challenges, but I put everything together. Again, we're coming back to this theme of authenticity, and it's okay to show that there were times that you struggled, but ultimately how you came through, right?
Mhm. Right. And I think though that piece about the vulnerability is, I think so much more of it is just thinking about showing that you're mature, showing that you're self-aware, showing that even when things don't go the way you had anticipated or you wanted, you can figure out a way to positively recorrect. And some of that is also showing that you also know sometimes when to ask for help, when to collaborate with others. And so I think sometimes we learn a lot more when we are reading things about failure versus successes in terms of, it's kind of behavioral based interviewing. How you, behaved in the past is a good indicator of how you'll behave in the future. And so again, if you were someone who could readily pick yourself up, dust yourself off, and move forward, having learned from that experience, I think that that's probably one of the best indicators of someone who's really primed for bigger and better leadership roles.
Right.
If I
Maren,
may,
perhaps. Please go ahead.
Sharon, self-awareness is so important. I'm so glad you raised that. I meant to mention it earlier. Showing that you are self-aware, I think that's something that business schools really look for, people who are self-aware. And I think through all the essays, that's something that needs to come through.
And in that self-awareness, perhaps even an assertiveness, because Maren, if someone's thinking, well, schools like the GSB, Kellogg, Tuck, Darden, lots of very collaborative schools, Haas, Duke, there are plenty of them. So maybe I should always be looking at it through the lens of we as a team. But it's important that the I of the individual also emerges, right? So that the admissions committee can get a sense of the impact and the contribution that you personally have made.
Yeah, it's a balance, and it's always something that I find that clients struggle with, especially when you're fighting against things like imposter syndrome, right? But as we get deeper into those conversations, I think the more detail you're able to suss out about those leadership examples, the better I can help you kind of hone in on what your individual contribution was to that. Certainly, it was the team, but whereabouts in that process were you individually highly contributing to the outcome? Was it? And what's interesting is that as you talk further about those examples and really dive into those details, and some people are apprehensive about that because it is hard work to do that, to remember those things. But the more you do that, the more then I can say, oh, well, then there's several different ways that you can share that example, right? Within this allotted word count, what exactly are you going to shine a light on? Some people during that conversation, we've identified that they were actually the earlier identifier of the non-status quo idea. And that's huge, right? So we've got to include that little nugget. Sometimes it's just that one line that changes that whole story. But again, as we were saying before, really hard to be objective unless you have somebody like a coach who's kind of guiding you through these examples to be able to suss out, oh, that was actually extraordinary that you did that.
Yeah.
That's got to be that line that's in there. And if it goes unsaid, then the story changes, right? And it becomes, like you said, Matt, it's more of it's the team, which is important, yes, but what was your individual contribution?
Now, you talk about outcomes, and Sharon, perhaps that's a leader into the idea of career goals. You've witnessed yourself, bringing together this talented, diverse, open-minded bunch of classmates, and anything that they shared in the application suddenly is off the table, and they go off to follow other career paths. But it is an anchor for a lot of schools. They want you to talk about career goals. What is it, perhaps, that you're trying to convey? Maybe even touches on Melissa's point of self-awareness. Talk us through the career goals essay.
So I did spend part of my career in higher education working in career services as well. And so I know that when I was reading MBA applicants, in the back of my mind is, are they going to be successful here in our program? Do they have a realistic roadmap of how to leverage our offerings to be successful in the short term as well as in the long term? In terms of long-term goals and short-term goals, the school's very specific about it. I mean, short-term goals should be things that are kind of grounded in reality, that you can demonstrate that you have a thought out plan. And some of that goes with doing research. Sometimes, I would be surprised when it would seem like an applicant had never looked at our career stats. I mean, all of the schools publish them. So obviously take a look at who were the top companies coming to that school, what industries were most represented. And so being able to speak to in the short term, building upon the kind of the skills that you have, the skills that you're going to gain while you're at that school, and how they mesh with what that school is already doing well in terms of working with students in career placement and recruiting and treks and things like that. We oftentimes will get questions, though, too, if someone wants to make a big career pivot. Well, again, is it grounded in something that's realistic? Do you have transferable skill sets or interests or things that you can parlay that make sense if you're trying to achieve a pivot, and making sure that you are able to convey that to the school with some well thought out reasoning to why this making a pivot is something that's sensible and something that can be realized based upon their resources and your drive, really, too. In the long term, schools are looking for people who are going to make an impact, right? And so I think it's not just listing like, I want to be a COO someday of X, Y, or Z company. It's more of like, what is the influence you want to have in the world? And I think that that's something that you want to really put out there boldly, because again, schools are most proud of alumni who go forward and represent the name and the brand well, and that they are doing things out there for kind of the better good of society, not someone who just shows, that I know I want a fancy title. But really, again, what is that motivator behind that title? What is the influence that you want to make? And just kind of getting back to that, making sure that you're showing with specificity that you have researched what I call kind of the 3 Cs. What is the curriculum, co-curriculars, and the community? So what are pieces of that academic piece that you're going to leverage, that you recognize you have specific knowledge gaps, and how are they going to be filled if you attend this specific program through coursework, through research centers, through professors who host different treks and things like that. Thinking about the co-curriculars, what are some of the clubs and conferences that are aligned with your career goals? So having a position within the healthcare club or things like that, being sure that you can demonstrate that. And then thinking about the community at large, though, too. And community can mean a lot of different things. What is sort of the supportive environment to get you to where you want to be in terms of your career goals? Community can also be proximity, obviously in the Bay Area, what are you going to leverage? Haas every year has a huge Silicon Valley networking event that a lot of students find leads through that. And so how can you participate in that as well? So I think, again, it's just showing that you have a recruitment alignment with the schools that you're targeting, and that you're very able to show that, but not in a superficial way. I mean, reference specific conversations that you've had. Some schools are open to allowing prospective students coming to some of the recruitment events. So again, demonstrate this interest beyond just sort of a rudimentary web search. And really talk about some things with specificity, because there's lots of ways to connect with alumni, students, sometimes faculty, as well as the admissions team as well.
Yeah. Perhaps just one additional question, Melissa, for you. And with a senior leadership role that you had at INSEAD, it's one of the top 1-year programs. And candidates often say, it was like drinking from a fire hydrant. It went back so quickly. Do you think as a consequence, a program like INSEAD or some of the shorter programs want greater definition in terms of career goals, because you don't have the 2 years and, the time between year 1 and year 2 to work things out?
Absolutely. So it depends on your intake too, because there's one intake where there are 2 intakes, and there's one where you can do an internship, right? So that's a little bit, but generally speaking, yes, I think absolutely. That short-term goal needs to be, I think people that aren't so clear on what they want to do afterwards actually opt out of a school like, a 1-year school, because they need the time to figure it out. And so, yeah, definitely, a much
And it's
clearer
okay if you
picture.
say consulting.
Not necessarily the long term. The long term remains sometimes, there's an idea that's put out there, but it's less important, right? I mean, it's sort of like this is the stepping stone to the next, But you definitely need to show that you've thought about it, you've done your homework, all the things that Sharon mentioned, the legwork that goes into figuring out what your next step is if you're not going back to the same company or staying in the same field. It's really important.
Right. Okay. Great. Well, we'll keep moving. And as we go, and again, viewers, perhaps some of you are following on the recording, and you can always then reach out to us and we can talk through your own personal stories. But coming back to the love story that we began with and demonstrating school fit, what is this great alignment? Sharon, I always think about the 4 pillars at Haas and, curiosity and challenging the status quo. Talk to us about that sense of alignment. What would make you such a great match in both directions?
Well, again, it's just moving beyond the brochure or cursory website searches, and it's really connecting with students and alumni to hear firsthand about their experiences, but also being strategic in the questions that you're asking those people. I think that, some of the questions that I would recommend asking is like, what surprised you the most about your time at Haas? What are ways that the school supported your growth while you were enrolled there? What are some of the things that you take from your business school experience and still apply on a day-to-day? And so really asking kind of these deep questions. And people generally love to speak about their time in business school. And so I think you'll get a lot of really great information, which then sometimes turns into fodder for essays like, wow, I was even more jazzed about the Social Impact Club when so-and-so, Susie Snowflake, Snowflake told me about these different things that they're doing, and that totally tracks to what I want to do based upon some of the things that I've done in my community beforehand, some of the courses I want to take, how I want to transform my career. So I think that that's really important to dig a little bit deeper and have conversations. Right now, there's lots of MBA fairs going on throughout the world. So it's a great way to connect. Most of the schools have alumni who come along, have current students who come along. And so that's a great way to start making connections. One thing, though, that I think is really important about demonstrating school fit is I would sometimes read candidates and I would start getting a little bit turned off though, because it was a lot of take, take, take. This is what I want to take from your program, but not really showing what you want to do to help elevate the community when you're part of it. So I think, again, making sure that when you are researching schools and thinking about the school fit, especially if that's a huge part of the culture, how can you demonstrate that you've researched areas where you want to make an impact as well? So, for example, if you're someone who's been engaged in tutoring at Promise students, and then coming to Berkeley Haas, you find out that they have Boost at Haas, which is a great program to help mentor young people who want to become entrepreneurs, like showing that linkage. Like, this is something that I've already been passionate about, something I've been involved with. And wow, I'm really excited about the opportunity to have some continuity with that, should I be admitted to your program. So I think that it's important to show not just that you've done your homework, but you've really thought, beyond the web search, beyond the brochure, how you're going to thrive at a program, and again, how you're going to elevate that community.
Right. This idea, Maren, of perhaps digging a little deeper, because sometimes for candidates, it's like this tick box exercise of, well, I've talked to a current student, that was Susie Snowflake, and I've memorized every page of the website, which might be a little unsettling. Do you think that there are ways through the conversations, the outreach that you'd suggested, LinkedIn and others, where the school gets the sense, they've really taken the time to get to know us in a very personally relevant way, not just about rankings or
Yeah.
what Sharon was evidencing earlier for Haas.
Yeah. Be the driver here. Put yourself in the driver's seat, right? This is your journey. You know where you're ultimately going towards. Show me that you've done the homework to know you got a plan A, but you also got a plan B, right? So it's like it's practical and logical, shows me that you've got good self-awareness and you understand your industry, right? You know it in depth. A lot of times the readers won't be from your corporate background or what have you, right? You are the driver of this journey. So talk to me about what that journey looks like on the other side of things. Sometimes they will have at least a career management experience, but not necessarily your own specific industry at the level of depth that you have, right? But then also be curious and aspirational, right? That's that stuff that's going to really light me up when I read your career journey, your fit with the school. So I've had clients who said, okay, well, logical and practical, I could continue on this route and I'm going to level up. This is a post-MBA title role within this particular company where I've been because I have a return offer, or this other place. Fine, great. Then like, well, but I'm actually kind of curious though, because this school is very good at nurturing this also sort of like budding entrepreneurial spirit, right? I think that's okay to talk about. I think if that's part of your journey and you have the 2 years to be able to experience that, and you're really super curious about it, and you have some semblance of that being of interest to you, right? I think that that's okay too. I think that you can do both really well, but the point is you are the driver. You're the driver of this vehicle, this journey that you're on towards these career goals that you've laid out. You're driving through this school. A lot of schools will give you some flexibility in that second year. I was able to create the curriculum that I wanted that was uniquely fit to my own self, right? That's a huge opportunity. So are you going to be the sort of person who really takes advantage of that because you understand yourself enough What it looks like, what it's going to look like, and how best to seek those resources and to take best advantage of it.
Right. Some of us at Fortuna very bravely tease one of our directors, Caroline, who was INSEAD's admissions director for 7 years. INSEAD has this monster application, 7 essays, there's videos in there. But she very calmly, in that British style, explains, well, it really gives the candidates the opportunity to share their story. But many schools, it is, what, 1, 2 essays, and then they pop in an optional essay. Now, Sharon, if you've got the chance to share something else, is an essay really optional? How would you strategically look to use this to your advantage?
I think there are two flavors of optional essays, if you will. I think that there is one that tends to be crafted in the sense, here's how Duke writes it. If you feel there are circumstances of which the admissions committee should be aware, for example, unexplained gaps in work, choice of recommenders, academic performance, please explain them here. So that prompt is really getting at addressing any red flags that might be in your profile. And that gives you opportunities to speak to things like perhaps you had a lower GPA in undergrad because you were also balancing work at the same time, or a family member was ill or something like that. So I think that with that optional essay that is written in a way to address red flags, only use it if you need it. This is not the opportunity to talk about your hobby pogo sticking around Europe because you want the admissions committee to have that and you shoehorn it in, right? That's not what that is intended for. A quick word on that, though, if you are using that essay to address anything that might be a perceived weakness in your application, stick with the facts, right? Short and sweet. But I also think it's important to show how maybe you've mitigated any perceived weaknesses. So, for example, if you had lower quant grades, have you taken MBA math? Have you taken extra coursework? Things like that to bolster your foundation. Really demonstrating to the admissions committee you understand the academic rigor of what's going to be expected of you, and that you have made sure that that you've again bolstered your foundation so that you will be successful. You will be able to thrive and do well in that program should you be admitted. So I think that's sort of the first flavor, is really getting at things that addresses any sort of red flags. And then the second one, though, this is like the one that I think people struggle with, like, okay, so am I supposed to do it? Is it really optional? I think if you get a prompt from, for example, MIT says, we invite you to share anything else you would like us to know. Obviously, if you are given a green light to go ahead and say more, and there's something that you feel is missing from your application, to put in a different kind of depth to your candidacy, absolutely take advantage of that. And it does help, I think, to work with a coach to kind of think strategically. Okay, well, we covered A, we covered B, we covered C, but oh, wow, now we have an opportunity to also talk about D. So let's do that. But again, it should be something that really rounds out your application and shows sort of, again, another level of depth to your profile.
Right. And presumably, Melissa, the golden rule is not to go back to A or B from the list. That the school already got that, making sure that it is now, distinct
Yes.
additional content.
Absolutely. And, actually, there are some cases like INSEAD, for example, is one of the schools where you don't really have an opportunity to say what you want to do there, why, etc. So if you don't have a story to, sort of a case to make for why GMAT didn't go so well, what you've been doing since or whatnot, it can be an opportunity, as I say, to write a little love letter, this is, INSEAD is my, number one dream school, and this is why.
Mm,
And then to your point where it's not just about why the school, what I want to do, but also what I'm going to bring to the party.
right. Maren, I'm trying to imagine you reading through all of these hundreds of applications and just holding your head in your hands, thinking, no, 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 why did they tell me this? Or common mistakes. There must be some obvious ones, school names and other things, but perhaps the bigger picture, the just fundamentals that were missing, or the way that the candidate have approached them. What would your advice to anyone be? Avoid these particular mistakes.
Yeah, I won't go through every single one. I know that we're a little over time. So the kind of my bigger picture ones, as we've been talking about, very on point in terms of the content of this webinar, have a very clear log line that AdCom can talk about. Who are you specifically in this role different than the stats that we already know, right? At the end of every single essay that you write, if you dropped it on the ground and somebody who knows you picks it up, well, they know that it's you. Are you the driver of that journey? Is it clear that you're not just checking the boxes and throwing in what you think that admissions committees wants to hear, right? I think it's a very handy thing. Again, I ask myself and stop all the time. So what? So what to a layman? So what to your grandmother? So what to anybody who's not of this industry? What's the big so what point and purpose of what it is that they're writing? And then the final thing I'll say is that I hope that this, if anything, that this webinar has convinced you that this is not a love connection with AI. You and AI alone can't go to this level of depth. It's the relationships that are going to help you do research. Absolutely, there's huge benefits, but it won't replace that kind of deep, thoughtful, introspective work that you really ought to do.
Well, the admissions director at INSEAD had commented to us they don't see spelling mistakes anymore, and given the international community, you might expect to see at least a few. But Maren, you have spoken. There's another session we did specifically on Stanford and AI. All of those schools sitting on the stage, they sort of shook their head. It's such a turnoff for them because they really want to get to know the candidate, right? And this is I think the limitation. AI just cannot capture your personal voice.
Right. Yeah.
It has a head, it doesn't have the heart.
We've carried our heart through this entire
Well said,
session.
Sharon.
We'll perhaps we'll go fairly quickly now through these final sessions and final advice. Getting started, and Melissa, with you, you said before we rush into essays and putting everything together, reflection again, back to that theme of the beginning, introspection, really taking that time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's the way you get to an authentic, compelling essays, right? Is the introspection. I mean, I've worked with candidates who have come because they quickly wrote, they sent in their applications, they got dinged from every school, and they've come back to try to then apply to other schools because they hadn't done the work. It's imperative. I mean, if you want to do a really compelling application.
Right. Sharon, I feel like the second point here is something I've heard you say because it talks to judgment. Focus on the need to know, not just the nice to know. How do you make that distinction?
I think in our work with our clients, it's just like, distilling down things, this is a very concise process. Schools will say we want to get to know you, but you have 200 words to say it, right? So what is your news flash? Why is this going to land with a school and why is this important? And again, getting to that piece too, that the application, the essays, this is what buys you, a ticket hopefully to be invited to interview. And that's where you can also talk about the nice to know. But I think it's just making sure that you are really laser focused on what is your writing agenda in a way? What are like 3 absolutes that I want a school to know about me and being focused on that?
Right. For a candidate, Maren, my final question to you that had the confidence to be vulnerable, that had the confidence to share something that hadn't worked out and how they managed to work through it. Could you tell in all of the applications you ever read when a candidate had really enjoyed and embraced this opportunity applying to business school, to think about these things with that sense of openness?
Sure. Yes. Yes, I think that if you go through the process of understanding that vulnerability is really key to growth and to learning, and if you're open yourself up to approaching failure or challenges with a growth orientation, with a curiosity, then you really opened yourself up to quite a bit of learning, and you can be very additive to the people around you, and vice versa. So the sorts of people who can share that openly are the sorts of people who are really going to be able to very clearly demonstrate to the admissions committee that they are the sorts of people that will ultimately, and ironically so, these are the people that thrive in a program because you're bringing your whole self, and you're asking those good questions, and you're inviting others to ask those questions too, to get to that deeper level of thought.
Mm. Well, the time that I spend with my colleagues at Fortuna Masterclasses like this, it's my love story. I love sitting here, sharing these insights, all of the perspectives, the experiences, of course, you've had, how you've helped candidates connect those dots, tell those stories. I always describe you as the dream team, and with your school backgrounds, it brings this level of guidance deeper, really unearthing those connections, finding the impact, the resilience, and everything else that goes into those stories. And in the same way, our viewers, that each of your personal stories, the essays that you put together for business school, are yours. It's your unique and distinct voice. We treat the free consultations that we give to everybody in that same way. It's your story. We'll start by saying, well, what would be the most helpful for you? And we never quite know where that discussion over the next 30, 35 minutes might go. But do reach out to us so that, your specific questions, whether it's about the schools, whether it's about the essays that we've discussed today. There's one Q&A question that I'm going to put to Maren. An example of the most memorable why Stanford. Does one come to mind?
My own?
Perhaps that's the best place to start. That would certainly be your story.
So my most memorable, I think that, and I think that I started to talk about this because I appreciate when it happens. I think there's a way that you could take practical and logical too far to mean I have to have every step along the way ironclad. And that contradicts what we're talking about imperfection and learning and growing, right? Because you're not going to know everything when you're there. And it is a learning environment. We don't want somebody who's robotically going to go through and get, check these boxes and then spit you out and you're on the other side, right? But I've had people who are very just curious and ambitious and aspirational. I actually have one client right now that I can think of that she is considering a firm that doesn't exist yet, right? So she knows her industry so well, and she's gotten to that level of self-reflection where she's like, and we were, talking about her own personal story, her journey, and then the resources that are at the school, and we're navigating this. And it was this aha of like, well, the reason why it's not, well, we can't call it logical, but the difficulty is it doesn't exist. So how do you create that why Stanford? Well, why Stanford is all about non-status quo. It's all about non-traditional, right? It's all about how do you, this isn't going to make any sense to anybody unless you've seen the presentation, but how do you take that ketchup bottle, the condiment bottle, and who was that first person to flip it over and say, okay, from here on out, condiment bottles should be flipped over on their head because that's easier to dispense them, right? So that's okay, actually. That's okay that it doesn't exist out there. We could take little sprinklings of like what is out there, but we do have to go through that process of like, what is out there and why is this going to be compelling and why is this going to work, right? So it's a little bit of a riskier thread. So let's do that work. But anyway, so that one is really exciting me right now, to tell you the truth. It's a little bit different.
One of our viewers, I'm going to adapt the question. They've asked about how many clients a Fortuna coach works with in each round, and we do limit it. Because we're taking that time for everybody's distinct individual story. So sort of 10, 11 clients per round. Part of that, Sharon, I think, and as it comes to the essays, with the background that you have with hundreds, thousands of applications you've read, do you know when an essay is good to go?
Yes. I will say though, all of us at Fortuna, one thing I love about our firm is that we all have lots and lots of experience, but we're also not arrogant about our strengths as coaches. And so if we ever have an inkling of like, gosh, I'm really loving this, except there's a little piece I'm not quite sure about, we will definitely ship things to each other, to our other colleagues and say like, hey, Maren, if you have like 10 minutes, can you go through this? We're a little bit, we're excited about it, but we're not sure about this one section. I mean, I think we're all very giving of our time with not just our clients, but also with our fellow coaching team to be sure that we are doing right by our clients, to be sure that what they're going to be submitting is the best work possible. And so I think that, yes, I'm very confident in spotting a great essay. And at the same time, I'm also very great at making sure, though, too, that I consult with others if I ever have a little bit of doubt.
Right. And final question, Melissa, you always, a characteristic of bringing the best out of people, helping them to shine. And candidates say, well, maybe I'm 3 years older than the average or don't have as much international experience. You always seem to find this way to help them have ownership, the less traditional candidate. And that's the thing, right? There's no one profile. A school's looking for. The essays are this great illustration to then be able to share and own your own story.
Yes, definitely. I mean, thank you for the compliment, but but uh, everybody has a different profile, and there are the more traditional profiles, the finance, what the engineers maybe even, but there are the other profiles are interesting too because everybody brings something to the whole experience, and that's what you need to be able to show to the school is that you're coming to take but to give,
Mm,
and you have a lot to give. And
mm,
it may not appear from your resume, it may not jump off the page that you would be a great candidate for school X, Y, or Z. And
mm.
that's where in the essays, you really drill down to show different things that wouldn't be obvious. Maybe you don't have a super international background, but you're applying to a school where that's important. So how can you find other elements from your background to show that you're, interested, that you want to have a global career, that you've made moves in that direction? That's just, one example, of course.
Well, we mentioned earlier candidates that just seem to want to take and take and take, and I think it's so consistent. Your coaching superpowers, all three of you, have been helping candidates to see that they all have so much to give and to contribute to these different communities. This was the first in a series of 3 masterclasses focusing on the essays. Now, if you've just finished, thank you for staying live for the recording, or if you've captured it on YouTube. As you've seen on that YouTube channel, there is a ton of resources, whether they're school-specific, different parts of the application, trends in the industry, and on the Fortuna website, there again, there are many, many resources. You can imagine with more than 50 individuals working across all of the top schools, being able to pool, as Sharon was saying, and reaching out to colleagues for these additional perspectives. Next week, we'll be talking about the other voice in your application, that of the recommenders, and how we can best work with them. And then that final piece, pulling together the resume and the application form, that will be at the end of the first week of August. But thank you, all of you, for your questions, for sharing with us. You can see why Fortuna is my love story. Melissa, Sharon, Maren, thank you for a great session together.
Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.